heard a lot about the theory of matching, and I'm going to tell you about a particular project in market design. But I thought before I did, I would introduce market design a little more than maybe it had been done in the more technical talks this morning. So let's think about market design a little bit, because market design is an ancient human activity. You know, when archaeologists go around the world looking at stone axes and arrowheads, they find them thousands of miles from where they were quarried and built. So markets are older than agriculture. So markets are one of the things that people do, and it's human artifacts. And what's the other big human artifact that sometimes seems to us like natural phenomena that we should just study as, you know, they are what they are? Well, it's language, right? So I'm speaking to you in English, but I didn't create English, and we normally think of English as just this big natural thing that happens to us, and similarly with other natural languages. But of course, languages and markets are human artifacts. And as we understand more about markets, we don't have to think of them as outside of our control. And so what market design is about is sort of an engineering approach to economics. How can we think about markets, whether they're doing what we want them to do, whether they're working well, and whether we can make them work better or create new ones. And just as there are lots of different kinds of natural languages, there are lots of kinds of markets. And so one of the focuses of these lectures is going to be matching markets. And matching markets, as Eric and Scott told you about, are markets where you care who you're matched with, and where prices don't do all the work. And of course, we're going to hear about some other markets where prices don't do all the work. Markets where you have to put together packages of very heterogeneous goods, things like that, and where prices might not even exist that could clear the market. And Paul will talk about some of those when he talks about auctions. So let's think for a moment about the kinds of markets where prices do all the work, because a lot of times in economics, we tend to think of markets as commodity markets. And commodity markets are markets where you don't care who you deal with, because 5,000 bushels of number 2 red winter wheat, you don't care who you buy it from. It's already been specified sufficiently that you know what you're getting. So financial commodities like stocks in a corporation are like that. You don't care who you buy 100 shares of AT&T stock from. You don't care whether they've taken good care of those stock when they had them, and they don't care whether you're going to take good care of the stock. It's only the price that matters, and the job of the New York Stock Exchange is price discovery, to find the price that will clear the market. But lots of markets don't work like that. And so matching markets, which are going to be one of the focuses of this conference, include the markets where you can't just choose what you want, even if you can afford it, because you also have to be chosen. So I teach at Stanford University, and you know, it's a fancy American university, and we don't set tuition so that supply equals demand. Stanford doesn't choose its entering class by raising the prices until just enough kids remain who want to go to Stanford. It's expensive to go to Stanford, but it's cheap enough that lots of people would like to go. And Stanford has an admissions office, so they do selection. So there are prices. It costs money, but it's not, the price doesn't decide who gets what. And labor markets are like that too. You can't just decide you want to work for Google. You have to be hired. And so these are markets that have all these other institutions than just price clearing to help clear the market. And so they're a lot like marriage. There's courtship on both sides. You can't just choose your spouse. You also have to be chosen. So the reason we call the field market design, I think, I blame it on Paul Milgram. You know, he picked that name early on. I think it's a great name, but a more descriptive name might be marketplace design. Because sometimes in economics, we think of the market as, you know, you guys have supply and other guys have demand and you're the market. But what market designers do is think, fine, how should that work? How should we decide who gets what? How should we design the marketplace? And so marketplaces have to do a couple of things to facilitate markets. One is they have to bring enough people together so that you can get trades. So they have to make the market thick. And then sometimes when you've made the market thick, there are so many potential trades to evaluate that it's hard to evaluate them in the time available. So a penalty of success in making the market thick is that markets sometimes become congested. And to work well, a market has to let you deal with all the transactions that you want to. And then it also has to be safe or trustworthy to deal with. And so I'm going to tell you aspects of that about the medical marketplace that I'll talk about today. But you might think about that as the week goes on, as the course goes on this week and next, in context of other markets as well. And another thing which I didn't really expect to learn, but we've seen in a number of markets, is that some kinds of transactions are repugnant. Lots of people have intuitions about economic transactions that sometimes seem foreign to economists. I'm going to be talking about that. We'll talk about that a little. Itai Ashlagi and I will touch on that when we talk about kidney exchange. But I'll make that the subject of my Arrow lecture on Monday, talking about what kinds of transactions some people would like to do and other people think they shouldn't, and how that constrains some of the markets that we see. So far this morning you heard some economic theory, and market design is trying to be an engineering part of economics. So let's spend a few moments thinking about how economic engineering is different from economic theory. And one thing that's different is we're not going after eternal truths here. Engineering has a lot to do with the environment in which it happens. So here's Pythagoras' theorem, which is a real theorem, right? It's true for all right triangles everywhere. It was true when Pythagoras proved it. It's true now. If you meet a right triangle, you can tell it Pythagoras' theorem. It'll be just as relevant to the life of the right triangle as it ever was. But bridges are a different story, right? Here's a pretty good bridge because it was built by the Romans and it's still standing. I assume it's had a lot of maintenance. But that's a really, really good bridge. But that's not what modern bridges look like. Modern bridges look like this bridge that we see when we drive into Jerusalem. And so what's the difference? Well, one difference is technology. We can build better bridges today. Another difference is when you build bridges, people's behavior starts to change. They start coming into town with their wagons, and pretty soon you've got traffic and you need bigger bridges and more bridges. So building marketplaces also changes people's behavior, and some of the things we deal with in market design and some of the reasons that market design doesn't last forever, but you have to keep updating it, is that people's behavior changes when you build successful markets. And Itai and I will talk particularly about that when we talk about kidney exchange. And the matching markets that I've been involved in, you're actually going to hear about several of them here. We're going to hear about medical labor markets now, and then later about school choice and about kidney exchange. But the first two of these, medical labor markets and other labor markets, some of you may eventually go through the North American market for economists, these are markets where money is important. These jobs pay wages. But it's like getting into Stanford. It doesn't determine who gets what. The market doesn't clear by adjusting prices until supply equals demand. And the other two markets that we'll talk about here, school choice and kidney exchange, the other two matching markets that there'll be talks on, these are markets where we explicitly disallow the use of money. It's against the law in in most places in the world, explicitly against the law to buy a kidney. There's a legal market in the Islamic Republic of Iran, but nowhere else. And in schools, in public schools, we think of going to school as both an obligation and a privilege of citizenship. Public schools are free. We pay for them with tax money. You can't pay more to get a better public school. You can send your kids to private school. So these are markets where either money is not the critical factor or where it's not used at all in deciding the allocation. Now, we're also going to hear about other kinds of market design in the course of this course and the next 2 weeks. We'll hear about auctions in various forms and how having to assemble packages of auctions can make prices not do all the work, sometimes because prices may not exist that clear the market. And we'll hear, later on, we'll hear from Eric Budish, who isn't here yet, who will tell us about how speed of transactions in financial markets can sometimes interfere with their thickness. So there's a lot of things going on that are going to intersect with matching but aren't all the same as matching, and that are going to intersect with theory but aren't all the same as theory. Yes?
But isn't this true with kidneys also, that the pool of kidneys can be too small if you always run the algorithm at the
So there's a problem of making the market thick, and we'll talk a little about this, but I think that's what you're talking about. Yes, absolutely. And Itai knows more than anyone in the world about kidney exchange, and he'll tell us, I think, a little about that. The answers surprised us a little bit. We expected to have very thick markets to get the benefits. It turns out to be less so than you would think, partly because of changes in behavior that have happened over time that affect the patient pool that we get. But we'll talk about this in 2 days, I think. Okay, so let me just end on sort of the introduction on sort of a lighter note that, you know, matching and market design have always been considered important. Here's a copy of a page from Vayikra Rabbah, the Talmudic discussion of Leviticus, Vayikra. And it starts off talking about a Roman matron, Matronita, and she is sort of a wise guy. And she asks Rabbi Yossi Bar Halafta, how long did it take God to create the world? And he answers her, 6 days. And then she says, so what's he been doing since then? And he answers her, he's been making matches. He's been joining couples. And the nice thing about this story is it actually goes on to say she does an experiment and it doesn't work out the way she had planned. So it's a nice story in lots of ways. The other thing I want to say to you about matching being important is that in the economics literature guide, subject matter, we've now gotten our own designation as a field. So we are D47. We're market design. And Scott Commoners, who you already heard, made up a bunch of buttons that say D47, and I think we have about 100 of them, and we'll put them out at some coffee nearby where you too can identify. This is what they look like. It's D47. So it's a secret code. Pardon me? There you go. So it's important to cite your sources. Okay, so let me get to the business of telling you about how doctors get their jobs in the United States. I'm not quite there yet, but I'm getting there. I want to tell you one more general thing about markets. Remember, part of the problem of marketplaces facilitating markets is to make the market thick. But it turns out it's a little hard to make markets thick because a thick market is something like a public good. And so there's free riding on it, right? Not everyone wants a thick market. Some people would like to go a little earlier than everyone else and take advantage of the thickness without having a lot of competitors, right? So buyers like lots of sellers and sellers like lots of buyers, but sellers aren't wild about having lots of other sellers and buyers aren't always wild about having lots of buyers. So sometimes markets unravel, and one of the ways they unravel is in time, getting earlier and earlier and having people give early offers as a form of competition. I'm going to tell you about that in the medical market, but it happens in a lot of markets. All these arrows point to transitions I've observed in some empirical market. And if you're having trouble, as the medical market did, and I will tell you, if you're having trouble controlling the timing of offers, you might try making some new rules that say when offers should be made. You might just try to enforce uniform dates. But again, if you don't do anything else to help the market work well, you're going to have congestion, because now you'll have a lot of people trying to transact at the same time. But without some effective rules, they won't be able to consider all the transactions they need to. And you've spent the morning hearing about the deferred acceptance algorithm. That's a centralized clearinghouse that solves, among other things, the congestion problem. It helps a lot of offers be considered at the same time. What is it that makes deferred acceptance algorithms solve the congestion problem? Partly it's that there aren't computers, and computers are fast. But the big thing is that you ask for decisions first. So you take people out of the time-consuming business of making decisions after they get an offer, which one do I like? You ask them for their preferences up front, and that's what allows you to computerize a clearinghouse. Now, there have been lots of computerized and other kinds of clearinghouses in the world, and many of them don't succeed. Many of them go back to being unraveling. But you've already heard a little bit about how the deferred acceptance algorithm makes some parts of the transaction safe. It makes it safe for the people making the proposals to reveal their true preferences, for instance. So that's the framework in which to think about the story that I'm about to tell you about the medical market and about other markets that you'll hear about in these next 2 weeks. So let me tell you about American doctors. This is a labor market. People go to medical school. And since about 1900, the standard first job for someone who gets an MD degree in the United States is called an internship, or more lately a residency. And that's a supervised position in a hospital where they're performing medicine, but they're not yet licensed to perform medicine. There's no state in the United States in which you can, right now, practice medicine with just your MD degree. You have to do an internship or residency. So those are really important jobs. It's sort of like graduate school. You know, where you go to graduate school has a big effect on your future career. So there's a lot of interest by the doctors in what hospitals they're going to go to. And there's a lot of interest in the hospitals about which interns and residents they're going to get. because the interns and residents do a lot of the work of the hospital. So in 1900, when this form of employment started, it used to be that around June of your last year of medical school, of your fourth year of medical school, you looked for a job and got one. These jobs tend to start around July 1st. But over time, hospitals started to compete with each other by making offers to likely candidates earlier and earlier. So about 1930, the standard time at which doctors were getting their jobs was around Christmas of the fourth year of medical school. And when you look at the medical journals, they're full of chat that says, you know, things are getting a little early, we're hiring our doctors without knowing their class standings, without knowing how they do in their final semester, we shouldn't go too much earlier. Well, by 1940s, a lot of doctors were being hired 2 years in advance of graduation. They were being hired after their second year of medical school. And that loses a lot of information. You can't tell who's going to be a good doctor after 2 years of medical school. And if you're a medical student, you can't even tell what kind of doctor you might want to be because you haven't yet experienced all the rotations that will give you exposure to different kinds of medicine. So there were lots of mismatches. You know, the mismatch I like to imagine is you've gotten an A in anatomy, you're in medical school, so you think you want to be a surgeon, and all the good surgical jobs are going after your second year. In the summer after your second year, you get a great surgical job for 2 years in advance, and now finally you get to see surgery happen and you discover that you faint at the sight of blood, you know, so that you don't want to be a surgeon, but the good jobs are all gone and things like that. So matching early was costly in information terms. And around 1945, the medical schools intervened, and the medical schools are a third party. They are not the doctors and they're not the hospitals. And they said, you know, you guys are not exerting any self-control. The market's getting earlier and earlier and the offers are more diffuse. We're going to just not release information before a certain date. We're not going to release transcripts, letters of reference, all that. And indeed, that controlled the unraveling of the market. And over the years, I think in 1945, they moved it into the junior year, the third year of medical school. And as they understood that they had control of the date, they moved it back into the senior year where it remains today and where they want it. So they were able to control the date. But they had a recontract, and they had a congestion problem. And the congestion problem made itself felt in the way offers were given and received. So in 1945, the rules were offers couldn't be made before a certain date, and they should be left open for 10 days. Well, that had some problems on the 10th day, because basically, supposing on the first day you get an offer from your third choice hospital, and you're on the waiting list of your second choice hospital. Well, you're feeling pretty calm. You have an offer in hand, and you have 10 days to wait, and your second choice hospital says to you, don't do anything without telling us. We like you a lot. If we get some rejections, we'll make you an offer. So you're sitting pretty, so you do nothing. Now, of course, if lots of people do nothing, then the waiting lists don't move. So on the 10th day, you're sitting there with an offer from your third choice hospital, and you're on the waiting list of your second choice. So a lot of bad things happened on the 10th day. Maybe you accepted an offer from your third choice, and then later you got an offer from your second choice, and you accepted that too, and it took a little while for you to tell your third choice that you weren't coming, and by that time all the other people on their waiting list were spoken for, things like that. So in 1946 they decided to just eliminate the 10th day, and they only said that offers had to be open for 8 days. Right? So that laugh shows that you guys are market designers. You understand that the rules are going to matter, and not just in a simple way. So by the time they eventually decided to do a centralized match, which was a real innovation, they had gotten down to exploding offers. 12-hour delay had been proposed and rejected as too short, so you were in a world of real exploding offers where you'd get an offer on the phone and have to say yes or no on the phone, because the person giving you the offer would say, listen, we've learned from experience that if you say, can I think about it, and we let you think, then everyone else on our list is spoken for. So you just have to say yes or no now. So what that means is you're losing the benefit of the thick market. There are a lot of people making transactions at the same time, but you're on the phone and you have to decide, do I take this offer from my third choice, or do I hang up the phone and hope it will ring again? That's a tricky decision. So they started to use a centralized clearinghouse of the form that people go on their interviews, they exchange information, and then they were asked for rank order lists. What's your first choice job, your second choice job, your third choice job? Who's your first choice resident, your second choice, your third choice? And back in those days, they processed this on card sorting machines. I'm looking here at Elliot Parenson, who's sitting here, and he's almost old enough to remember that. But it worked great. One of the things that I found in my early work on it, and other people who had looked at it understood things like this, was they were doing something that was equivalent to the deferred acceptance algorithm. Okay, so they had not quite, but they had stumbled upon, and there's a history of this. It turns out there had been a Boston pool plan that had been organized among the Harvard hospitals, and eventually that was what was adopted, and that was where the trial and error experience came. They did something that was equivalent to a hospital proposing deferred acceptance algorithm. So they got a stable matching. And it lasted for a long time. Say again?
What year was that?
1952. So Shapley and Gale were 1962. Right? So these guys, so remember, market design is an ancient human activity. We are only understanding it recently. So they got to a stable matching, and it worked really well for a long time. One of the things that started to threaten it over the years, and I'll tell you about various episodes of how it was handled, was the growing number of couples. So in 1950, the percentage of women in American medical schools was approximately 0. It was a little higher than that, experimental error. And today it's 50%, right? And in that intervening time, they started to notice that one of the things medical students can do is marry each other. They're really very busy medical students. So there started to be couples on the market, graduating from medical school in the same year, needing jobs. And so one of the things that Elliot and I got asked to look at in the mid-90s was should aspects of the design be changed, and how should couples be handled, things like that. Okay, so that's the story that I want to tell you. So this is going to be an engineering story, not a theory story, in the sense that I'm going to tell you some results that we understood in '95 computationally. But only recently have we understood them as theorems and things like that. And that's going to be a pretty standard story. So theory is a big, big input into design, but it's not the only input. Part of the thing about building things is you need them now. By the time they ask you to build something, they're ready to take delivery. And so you find yourself learning things in different ways than just theory. So I want to tell you about that, why it's not the only input, and and why it's important. Okay, so one of the things that makes it difficult is you've now seen some simple models of matching. There are men and women, or there are workers and firms. But the agents, in a many-to-one matching model, for instance, only want one job. It turns out the medical match has a couple of complications. I'm going to focus on just one today, but there are several. We called them match variations in those days. The one I'm going to focus on is couples. So the thing about couples is they need two jobs. And so let's think about that a little bit and how that changes the theory. It changes it quite a lot, but the story I'm going to tell you is how, so let me tell you the story this way. So in 1995, my phone rang. I was sitting in the University of Pittsburgh, and my phone rang, and on the line was a guy named Bob Barron, who was the director of the NRMP, and he said, would you consider directing a redesign of the match? And I still remember sort of the visceral feeling of that phone call, thinking to myself, too bad I picked up the phone. Because, why did they call me? I don't know how to do this. And I knew why they called me. I had written a book on matching with Marilda Sotomayor. But I also knew that the only things in the book that were going to apply directly to this new design problem were the counterexamples. Okay? So there were lots of theorems of kinds you've already heard, which said every simple marriage problem, stable matchings always exist. There's hospital optimal, there's student optimal, all of those theorems. And the counterexamples would say, supposing you had couples, All bets are off, right? So, so there we were. But I'll tell you about that. Okay, so there are two reasons you have to worry about the complications like couples. One is they can change the properties of the match, as I just said. But the other is you still have to place all the couples, right? So we're gonna be without, sort of tightrope walking without a net. We're not going to have the theorems, but we're going to have to do something to make sure the couples get jobs. So let me take a moment to think about couples in various ways. Okay? So I already mentioned that I only have figures back to the 1960s, but in the late 1960s, 8% of the graduates of American medical schools were women, and more recently it's 50%. So if there's time, we can talk at the end about the complicated matching of jobs and spouses and careers and families, which sort of go together. That is, before you could get 50% of American medical students to be women, you had to offer them the prospect of nice jobs and nice lives that would make it reasonable to go to medical school, right? In the United States, we now have senior doctors. You can find senior doctors who are married to each other and have children. You don't find senior lawyers who are married to each other and have children. Partners in big law firms are not married to other partners, and if they are, they don't have children. The job is too inflexible. But part of the market for doctors is that the job design has also changed with the market design. And so there are lots of things to think about in matching. Matching is a big deal in life. So they started noticing this in the 70s, that they were couples and they weren't all going where they were assigned. Up to the 70s, everything was working great. By and large, on July 1st, you found people where they'd been matched. But with couples, they sometimes found they weren't. And so they had a couples algorithm in the 1970s. So that's a long time ago. And the way the couples algorithm worked then is first you had to be certified by your dean as a legitimate couple. And after you were certified as a legitimate couple, you had to specify one member of the couple as the leading member. And the leading member, so then both the leading member and the other member of the couple submitted rank order lists just as if they were single. That is, what's my first choice job, what's my second choice, what's my third choice. And then they would run the deferred acceptance algorithm with the leading member in and see where the leading member got a job. Then they would look at the other member of the couple and edit his or her preference list to take away jobs that weren't in the same city. And initially, they decided what was in the same city, and later they let you decide what was in the same city. But and in that way, they'd hope to get two jobs in the same city, right? So one member of the couple would go through with a very edited list, depending on where the leading member went through. And this isn't just a 1970s problem. Yes, Kara.
It seems like being part of a couple could only be disadvantageous, so why was this?
There are other advantages to being a couple. I'm sorry, say once again.
Why is the certification step necessary?
Oh, it isn't today, but I think they just had a repugnance to letting people call themselves couples who weren't couples. Think about in the United States who we now allow to get married and who we didn't used to. I think it was moralistic, right? There was no, right, if you and I were not a couple, you're quite right, it would be a terrible idea for us to claim to be a couple. But people who were not married to each other might nevertheless want to work in the same city so that they could bring up their children, for instance. But deans might not approve of that. I think that's sort of the issue. Okay, so couples, it only makes sense to be a couple in that kind of algorithm if you want to live in the same city as your other couple member. And today, I think anyone can say they're a couple with anyone else. But, of course, if you and I don't want to live in the same city, we shouldn't do that. Okay? So there's a similar algorithm used today in Scotland. So this is not terrible. Yeah.
But there must have been coordination within the couple on how to write the list.
You bet. You bet. For sure. But still, it's hard to do, and I'll show you in a minute what I mean by that. Yes?
And just another question. Is it somehow that the weakest part of the couple that determines the matching?
No, the leading member determines where they go.
Yeah, okay, but if, for example, the leading member has some very good offers, and then the other part is very weak, he might not get.
Well, so the way they did it is if the leading member has good offers, then the leading member gets matched to Boston, say, where there are a lot of good hospitals. And then the other member will also look for a job only in Boston.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about that in a minute. Let me just say about Scotland that they're doing something very similar. They ask for individual lists. They have a way of combining them, and they determine which communities are commutable and which aren't. So this can't be good for the Scots any more than it was good for the Americans. Let's think why it doesn't work well, right? The problem with both these algorithms is they ask the couples coordinate, but they ask them for lists in a language that says, what's your first choice? What's your second choice? Just as if you were a single person. Well, so the iron law of marriage is that you can't be happier than your spouse. So think about that. Think about me and my spouse. We want two good jobs, and we coordinate with each other. We talk about it. So our two best jobs are, say, two jobs in New York. And our next choice is two different jobs in Boston. So our first choice is two really good jobs in New York, and our second choice is two really good jobs in Boston, and our third choice is two really good jobs in San Francisco. And that's how our choice list works. And then later, there's a good job and a bad job. That's pretty far down our list because you can't be happier than your spouse. So we consume pairs of jobs. But those algorithms I just showed you didn't ask us for our preferences over pairs of jobs. They say, what does the leading member want to go? And he gets a great job in Boston. And then the other member gets a terrible job in Boston. Well, they're not happy. They're going to get on the phone and call the jobs in San Francisco and say, have you got spots for us? And the San Francisco places are going to say, we had no idea you were still available. Absolutely. Because there are now going to be blocking pairs that involve couples that aren't captured in a deferred acceptance algorithm that is intended to create stability only for single people. So we're going to have to change our notion of what's a stable match when we notice that there are couples in the match, because couples are a pair of agents who act like one agent that wants two jobs. Okay, and until you ask them, until you allow the language in which they can make their bids, if you like, expressive enough, of course you can't get them what they want because you didn't ask them what they wanted. Okay, but it turns out that even if you ask them what they want and allow them to have pairs of jobs as their preferences, the theorem that you learned this morning that says in a simple matching market without couples, the set of stable matchings is always non-empty, is no longer true. Okay, so let me. I now want to show you some notation, but I don't want you to spend a lot of time trying to capture it because notation isn't the best way to understand this on the fly. So don't worry about the notation. Don't read the slide. Let me just point out some elements of it to you so you'll understand what kind of model we have to make to include couples in the models you've already learned this morning. Okay, so we're going to be a set of applicants, and the set of applicants are going to be the single people and the couples. That's one way of looking at the set of applicants. So the couples are pairs AI and AJ, where, made up of the union of A2 and A3, where A2 are husbands, say, and A3 are wives. So I'm going to talk about the set of applicants in two different ways. On the one hand, I'm going to talk about them as the set of single people and the set of couples. This is how they see themselves. If I'm a single person, I want one job. And I have, New York would be a good job, Boston would be a good job. I have a list of preferences. If I'm a member of a couple, we want two jobs. Okay? But I'm also going to look at all the individuals. And the reason you have to look at them both ways, the couples as couples, that's because they think of themselves as couples and what they want has to do with being a couple, but also as individuals because my wife and I may be looking for entirely different jobs. She might be becoming a neurosurgeon and I'm becoming a pediatrician. So we're not even interviewing at the same jobs. When the jobs I interview at meet me, they don't know that I'm part of a couple and they don't care. Right? My wife and I want to be in the city, but they just see me and they say, would Al be a good pediatrician? So we're going to have to, when we look at the preferences of the firms, those are going to be preferences over individuals who we don't care if they're couples. Okay? There are some programs that have couples, in universities in the US we see this. If you work at a rural university, there are couples programs because more and more academics are married to each other. But let's not worry about that for the moment. So now we can talk about the single people will submit rank order lists over individual jobs. The couples will submit rank order lists over pairs of jobs. And the firms, the employers, the residency programs, they'll submit lists over individuals. They don't see you as a couple. They just see you. Okay, so a matching is now, we can talk about a stable matching. A matching is blocked by an individual in a hospital as a blocking pair the same way you heard this morning. But in addition, a couple can be involved in a blocking pair. And a couple can be involved in a blocking pair a couple of different ways. It could be that my wife and I would do better if I switched jobs and she stayed where she is. Or it could be we would do better if we both switched jobs. So we could be a blocking pair, the two of us, with either one hospital or with two hospitals. Okay? So you have to expand the notion of blocking pairs, and it's possible that you want to expand them even more. I think maybe Elliot will talk a little about that tomorrow. And so a matching is stable if it's not blocked either by an individual or a couple with, or by a pair, a blocking pair, or by a blocking consortium that involves the couple and its hospitals. Okay, so we have more ways to block, but it's still pretty similar in definition. And what you can see is that in the college, there's a counterexample really, not a theorem. That's what I mean when I say that the things in the book that I wrote with Marilda Sotomayor, the things that applied were the counterexamples. In the college admissions model with couples, the many-to-one matching market where some of the agents are couples and need two jobs, the set of stable matchings can be empty. And this actually comes from a 1984 paper of mine that I wrote about the medical match. And this is where I talked about how the early match was equivalent to the deferred acceptance algorithm. And I had an example. I'm going to show you a simpler example than the one I found. I had an example where the set of stable matchings was empty if you had couples. And in my previous life as a theorist, that was enough. I said, set of stable matchings can be empty. The couples problem is hard. Full stop, fine article. You know, so that's what I was thinking in '95 when the phone rang, and they said, do you want to make this hard problem your hard problem? Okay. So again, this is where we talk about engineering rather than just theory. What I knew is that it could be hard. There might be times when you couldn't find a stable matching. One of the things we'll talk about is why that happens so seldom, but we didn't know that then. So here's an example that will show you that it's hard, and it's easy to show that it's hard. Here's a tiny, example. There's one couple, and there's only one pair of hospitals that they're willing to move to. Otherwise, they'll stay where they are doing what they're doing. So their preferences are, if the couple is student 1 and student 2, and their preferences are they would like student 1 to go to hospital 1 and student 2 to go to hospital 2, and nothing else is acceptable. This is the end of their list. So they have a way to take care of themselves next year. If they can't get this, they won't move to Boston where those two hospitals are. Okay, that's all they're interested in. And here's student 3. He's single. He likes hospital 1 better than hospital 2. Here's hospital 1. Hospital 1 likes student 1 and then student 3. And hospital 2 likes student 3 and then student 2. And you can pretty quickly check, I won't go through it, that there's no stable matching. If the couple is matched, then S3 is unmatched and there's a blocking pair with S3. If S3 is matched, there's either a blocking pair with S3 or with the couple. Okay, so easy to check, simple example. When you find examples this small, one of the things you worry is you're going to find them all the time when you start doing matching, because it doesn't take 19 couples that in a non-commutative ring to make this happen. It happens in a really simple way. So let's think why the deferred acceptance algorithm doesn't work for couples, even when stable matchings exist, right? So one problem is stable matchings might not exist. We might have signed. Oh, incidentally, I should say to you, it turns out, I didn't prepare a slide for this, it turns out when you look at clearinghouses of this sort around the world, stable matchings are really important for success. Okay, so when you try enforcing unstable matchings through a clearinghouse, you find you're back in that part of the chart where they unravel again, things like that. And the reason is the following. Supposing there's an unstable matching. Now I'm going to show you, there were, in the 90s, there were 20,000 students a year in this market. There are 30,000 now. You might think it would be hard to find blocking pairs. But it's not that hard if it's known that there are blocking pairs that could be found. Why isn't it so hard? Supposing there's a central clearinghouse and it says to me, congratulations, you were matched to your third choice. Please proceed and sign a contract. This is all fairly voluntary, although there's a strong equilibrium that everyone goes through the match. But supposing it wasn't stable, how long would it take me to find out if I was part of a blocking pair? If I'm supposed to sign a contract with my third choice, I just have to make 2 phone calls to find out if I'm part of a blocking pair. Because if I'm part of a blocking pair, it'll either be with my first choice or my second choice. So I call up my first choice and I say, hi, this is Al. I did great in the match this year and I'm about to sign a contract, but I would prefer to be with you. I just wanted to check whether there was any chance you had an extra position. And they look down at their list. And if we're a blocking pair, they say, look at that. We like Al better than this guy who we're supposed to sign a contract with. And they say, you know, we just got an extra position. Come. And then they call up the other guy and they say, bad news. You know, we just lost the position. Sorry. But if it's a stable matching, then I call up my first choice. And they look at their list and they say, look at that. We like the guys we got. We like every one of them better than we like Al. And they say, you know, we do our matching through the match. We don't do side deals. And so, you know, people learn to stop calling up. They're not getting any traction by calling up. So you have to get a stable match. I'm not going to show you the evidence of that, but let's take that as a good ground rule. If you don't have a stable match, it's a lot harder to get people what you tell them to get people to do what you tell them to do when you do a centralized clearinghouse and say, here's where you're matched to, go ahead. So we want a stable match. But why is it hard to get using the deferred acceptance algorithm? Well, think about why the deferred acceptance algorithm gets you a stable match. When I'm single, I apply to a job. If I'm the best applicant they've gotten at that point in the algorithm, they hold my application, but they don't accept it yet. It's a deferred acceptance algorithm. And then later on, you apply for the same job, and they like your application better than mine, so they hold your application and they reject mine. And they never regret having either held my application for a while or rejecting it. They never want me back. And they didn't lose anything by holding it, because when you came along, you're even better, and they wouldn't have gotten someone better still if they had done something else. That's what it means. Well, you have to be a little careful here, but that's what we're talking about when we talk about whether the match is manipulable or not. So we have to be a little careful. But now suppose I'm part of a couple. So my wife and I have as our first choice 2 jobs in New York, and we apply to them as our first choice in the student proposing algorithm. And each place likes our applications better than other ones that they've gotten, so they reject some others, but they hold ours. Okay? Now you come along and you apply at the place where my application is being held. And once again, they like you better than they like me. So they reject my application and hold yours. That's great as far as it goes. But what happens with my wife now? Well, our second choice isn't 2 jobs in New York, it's 2 jobs in Boston. So the algorithm has to, in order to let us apply to those 2 jobs in Boston, the algorithm has to withdraw my wife from the position that was holding her application so that we can apply to 2 jobs in Boston. Now, when my wife's application is withdrawn, a potential blocking pair has been created, because in order to hold my wife's application, they had to reject somebody else's application. But they're not going to employ my wife or someone better. My wife is gone. So we'll have to remember when we construct the algorithm that there might be a blocking pair involving that hospital where we withdrew someone. They didn't fire her. She withdrew. Okay, so that's a different sort of thing. And supposing on the contrary, we're doing the firm proposing deferred acceptance algorithm. Well, that's not going to quite work either, because the important thing about the firm proposing deferred acceptance algorithm, they're proposing to the students, is when I get a second offer, I know which one I want to keep. But supposing, again, my wife and I, our first choice is 2 jobs in New York, 2 jobs in Boston, 2 jobs in San Francisco, 2 jobs in St. Louis. And supposing my initial offer comes in from St. Louis and my next offer comes in from Boston, and my wife's initial offer comes in from San Francisco and her next offer from New York. We haven't gotten a pair of jobs yet. I don't know which one to reject, because if I reject St. Louis and later she gets an offer from St. Louis, that might have been our first choice of the ones we could get. So we tend to hold offers, and when someone starts holding offers, the deferred acceptance algorithm doesn't proceed to a stable matching. Yeah?
What happens if you apply not to the same city but to the same institution? And the institution, by rejecting you,
Yeah.
is aware that he's rejecting.
That's a good question. Today I'm going to duck it because that's a relatively rare thing. Remember, when you say the same institution, what you mean is the same residency program at the same hospital. So it could be that my wife and I both are interested in internal medicine and that we're applying to the same program, and that we've identified ourselves as a couple. So then what you'll find when we talk about this is the language we allow the hospitals to speak isn't expressive enough for them to say, we want them both if we can get them both, and otherwise neither, right? For instance. Although Paul may talk about complementarities. I mean, that's the general problem here, and it's a hard set of problems that will encompass a number of the talks, is that up to now we've been talking about preferences that are substitutes. When you're a firm and you have preferences over workers, if you don't get one and you get another one later, you don't wish that you had the first one back because you want them as a pair. But couples have complementary preferences. I want a job in St. Louis only if my wife also gets a job in St. Louis. So we as a couple want 2 jobs in St. Louis or none. Now, what you're asking, I think, is could we allow the hospitals to express those kinds of preferences? And those cause some difficulties. So it's a good question. The design I'm going to tell you about today does not allow the hospitals to express those preferences. What a hospital can do as a matter of, that's not always a problem. If the hospital is in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, where my wife and I worked for a little while, there probably aren't a lot of other jobs around. So they could safely rank the 2 of us pretty high and either get both of us or neither of us, given that we want to be in the same city. But if the hospital is in Boston, then they might get, if they want both of us and are willing to take one of us in order to get the other one, they can't express that preference. Yes?
Here there's a problem with holding.
Yeah.
And this is bring us back to the issue of internalize the cost of holding. If we would have a mechanism that you can price that.
Prices may not exist when you have complementarities.
Yeah,
so.
but the price of holding an option, as done in option theory.
Right, but so maybe Paul will, I'm not sure if anyone will talk about the exposure problem and things like that, but prices don't work so well when complement preferences are present. So our intuitions from economics about prices clearing the market are not going to work when you have couples present. And an indication of that is that the set of stable matchings may not exist. And loosely speaking, I think we will hear from Scott about correspondences between the set of stable matchings and competitive equilibria. So stable matchings not existing is a signal that prices may not do what they want. All right. Another problem with couples is that even when the set of stable matchings is non-empty, the theorems that we learned, their conclusions may not hold. So here's an example with 4 hospitals and 2 couples, and you can work out that there are 2 stable matchings. And you notice that neither one is student optimal because student 1 and student 2 prefer this one, but student 3 and student 4 produce this one. And neither is it true that we have the rural hospitals theorem or the constant employment theorem because everyone is employed at this stable matching, but somebody is unmatched and unemployed at this stable matching. So some of the theorems you learned this morning, the theorems are always true, like Pythagoras' theorem, but their conclusions are not going to be true when we change the model so that we have couples. Okay? Okay, so let me give you a list of theorems that you saw this morning or were briefly referred to this morning that their conclusions aren't going to hold when there are couples. So in a simple matching market, one without couples, the set of stable matchings is always non-empty. We've seen that that's false. The set of stable matchings always contains a program optimal and an applicant optimal stable matching. I just showed you an example which shows that that's false when you have couples. The same applicants are matched and the same positions are filled at every stable matching. I just showed you an example that shows that conclusion isn't going to be true. And we have strategic results. In simple markets, when the applicant proposing algorithm is used, but not the hospital proposing, no applicant can possibly improve his match by submitting a rank order list, an ROL, that is different from his true preferences. So it's a dominant strategy in the applicant proposing algorithm, even in many-to-one problem, to state your true preferences. That's not going to be true when couples are present. Every applicant who can do better than to submit his true preferences when they're on the other side of the market can do it with a truncation. Okay? Maybe that's all I'm going to... And the best they can do is to do as well as they could at any stable matching. Okay, so there's a bunch of theorems that, there I am on the phone in 1995 and they're flashing in front of my eyes because they're not true when you've got couples. Okay, so now let me tell you about the market. So these are, Elliot and I looked at a couple of years of data that we used intensely as our sort of laboratory. And notice, first of all, that in those years there were around 20,000 students a year going through the market. Right now in the United States we have about between 16 and 17,000 graduates of American medical schools each year. We have about 23,000 jobs, and we have about 30,000 applicants. So we import foreign doctors is how we fill the 23,000 jobs with 16,000 applicants. There are, I know there's a medical program at the Technion, for instance, where American citizens come and earn medical degrees and often come back to the United States. So some of the foreign applicants are American citizens, some are not. There are a couple of other match variations I'm not telling you about today, but in those days we had, approaching 1,000 people as couples. So that's 500 couples. Last year there were more like 900 couples in the match. So a substantial number of people are couples. There are a couple of thousand residency programs. I think that's all I want to show you on this slide for now. Now, we know that the theorems that we know aren't going to be true, so we wanted to see how false they were. And we had all these data, so we're able to play computational games looking at what happens when you do some kind of program proposing deferred acceptance, some kind of applicant proposing, together with we're going to have to make an algorithm that'll take care of the couples. Okay? So I'm going to tell you sort of quickly about the kind of computational experiments we did. And there are going to be two kinds of computational experiments. Some of them are looking sort of blind at the data, that is, playing with the data and trying to understand where the stable matchings are and what they look like. And then when we find some surprising things, the surprising thing we're going to find is that the set of stable matchings looks really, really small. Then we can do computations. We didn't yet have any theorems on the simple models you heard about this morning. Okay, so today there are theorems about those models. But when Elliot and I started to look at them, we looked at the big complicated market and we thought the set of stable matchings looks awfully small. Nobody has ever really looked at the set of stable matchings for the simple markets that we understand. But we could do real theoretical computation because we know how to look at those markets. We know that in the simple markets, we know there's a man optimal outcome and a woman optimal outcome, say, in a simple marriage market. And so we can tell just how big the set of stable matchings is by comparing those two. Alvin?
But we don't know here that we have a true preference.
Absolutely, we don't. So we also have to talk about that. Absolutely. Good point. One reason we could be getting a small set of stable matchings is maybe we're looking at a fully equilibrated market where everyone's truncated down to a single stable matching. Absolutely. You have to worry about that, or think about it at least. Okay? So before we talk about computational experiments, let's think about some algorithms. Because remember, the deferred acceptance algorithm isn't going to work. Right? It doesn't handle couples gracefully, even when you allow couples to state their true preferences, because we're either going to be pulling couples out of, think in the student proposing algorithm, because we're going to be pulling couples out that will create new blocking pairs. So the basic idea that we went in with was we're going to start things off with a deferred acceptance algorithm. And we'll keep in mind that it's producing blocking pairs. And then we'll try to resolve those blocking pairs one at a time to get to a stable matching. Is that a question? No, you're just stretching. All right. Okay, so let's think about that for the marriage problem. And what I want to talk to you about is finding stable matchings by resolving blocking pairs one at a time. Notice that that's not what the deferred acceptance algorithm does. The deferred acceptance algorithm starts with everyone unmatched, and then it produces a matching. Okay? But supposing we had a matching and it wasn't stable. One thing you could do is you could say, find a blocking pair and match them to each other. That gives you a new matching. It's probably still not stable. So then you say, fine, there's another blocking pair, match them to each other. And the question is, could you, by trying to fix blocking pairs one at a time, could you get to a stable matching? And Donald Knuth had shown that you could cycle. You could end back where you were. Because there's nothing monotone about resolving blocking pairs. The blocking pair does better off, but you have to divorce them from the people they were matched to, and those people are now worse off. They're now single, where they'd been married. So welfare is not monotone. But John Van de Wet and I proved a theorem that says, in the marriage problem, there exists a sequence of matching starting from an arbitrary matching. If you have an arbitrary matching, then you can find a sequence that you solve one blocking pair at a time and you get to a stable match. Okay, so it can cycle. You can find yourself back where you are, but there's always a way to get to a stable match. So what Elliot and I decided to try to do was we're going to start with a match that was close to being stable, and then we're going to try to find a stable match, one thing at a time. Now, let me just quickly show you how that theorem works so that you get a sense of how you can find stable matchings by solving one blocking pair at a time. And the problem, remember, is that welfare isn't monotone. So the proofs about the deferred acceptance algorithm, which you heard this morning, have to do with the fact that the algorithm is finite, and if you have, say, the men proposing to the women in a simple marriage problem, then the welfare of the women goes up as the algorithm proceeds. They're always holding the best offer they've gotten so far. They get better and better offers until they don't anymore, and they accept those offers, and it's the man optimal stable match. Okay, but there's welfare going up throughout. But here you don't. Here, when there are blocking pairs, the blocking pair gets better off, but their spouses do worse. So what we're going to do is we're going to instead get monotonicity, get an algorithm that converges by saying, let's build a set that doesn't have any blocking pairs in it. And it'll start empty, and we'll add a pair that, that isn't a blocking pair to the current matching. And we'll keep adding pairs that aren't blocking pairs. And when we've got them all in, we'll have a stable match. So the monotonicity will be that the set is growing. So let's start off and have a matching that let mu1 be an arbitrary matching, and I say without loss of generality, let it be individually rational, because we're going to satisfy blocking pairs. So if it's not individually rational, we just create the divorces that we need to until it's individually rational. So now we've got an individually rational matching, and it's got a blocking pair, man 1 and woman 1. So let's find a new matching. Let's create a new matching, mu2. We'll satisfy the blocking pair. The new matching will be just the same as the old matching, except man 1 and woman 1 will be matched to each other, and whoever they were matched to in the first matching will be single. Okay, that's the new matching, and we put man 1 and woman 1 into this set A1. This is where we're going to collect pairs that aren't blocking pairs to our current matching. And so it's going to be a proof by induction. Let AQ be a subset of men and women such that there are no blocking pairs for mu q plus 1 for the next match in the sequence in the set AQ. And that mu q plus 1, so there are no blocking pairs contained in AQ, and it doesn't match any agent in AQ to any agent outside of AQ. So you can see we started with mu2. We got the inductive assumption off to a good start. We have this pair that's matched to each other. They're both in the set. They're matched to another pair, another person in the set, and they are not a blocking pair to mu2 because they're matched in mu2. So that's the inductive assumption. And then what we say is, supposing mu q plus 1 isn't stable, then there's some blocking pair such that one of them is contained in AQ. If they're neither of them contained in AQ, then we create the next matching by matching them to each other and putting them in. But supposing only one is contained, so there's a blocking pair that has some man in AQ, say, and some woman not in AQ. We want to add her to AQ to make it AQ plus 1. How do we get the new matching? Well, we have her do the deferred acceptance algorithm, have her initiate it just within the set AQ. That is, she is a member of a blocking pair with some man in AQ. But maybe that's not her favorite man. So let's have her start off approaching to her favorite man. And if he is not a member of a blocking pair with her, he'll reject her. And she proposes to her next favorite. And eventually, if she's a member of a blocking pair with someone, he'll accept her and reject who he's matched to, who now goes through the deferred acceptance algorithm just in AQ. So eventually we get a matching that has no blocking pairs within AQ, just as we do when AQ is everyone. And now we've added that's the new matching, and we've added a new pair, and so we've created the next matching in the sequence, and there are no blocking pairs inside. So we've actually created several of the matchings in the sequence if the deferred acceptance algorithm goes for a while. So that tells you that you can, in the simple marriage problem, you can fix unstable matchings by fixing blocking pairs one at a time. Now that's not going to work in a problem with couples because there might not be a stable match. If you run this algorithm on a problem with no stable match, it'll cycle. But at least it gave us the hope that we could find something. So, and incidentally, the title of that paper was Random Paths to Stability. We sort of said, you know, if you don't worry about the order, if you can just keep trying, the fact that there exists a path to a stable matching will eventually get you there. Now, I'm gonna skip some of the computational experiments that we worked on, but I'm going to tell you about. So let me show you this algorithm. There'll be a test at the end of the lecture. On the left-hand side here, it's just the deferred acceptance algorithm. Okay, this is the deferred acceptance algorithm, except we check whether couples are, we say, is a rejected applicant a member of a couple, and is AK's application currently being held by some firm, some other firm? So AIAK. Here's the point where we're checking, I've just been rejected. Now my wife is going to be pulled out of the firm that's holding her offer so that the two of us can apply to our next choice. And when that happens, when the answer is yes, we put the hospital that my wife was withdrawn from on the hospital stack. And we remember that hospital might have blocking pairs. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through and we're going to get a rough, almost stable matching by the deferred acceptance algorithm. And then we're going to try to look at these hospital stacks and one blocking pair at a time, try to find a stable match. Okay, so we do this and we find some surprising things. So here's our data set of a couple of years prior to when we did this work. And what we find is we do the deferred acceptance algorithm with applicant proposing or program proposing. Remember, there's about 20,000 students a year in these markets. And only about 1 in 1,000 is affected by whether we do the program proposing or applicant proposing algorithm. So if this were a simple problem, if this didn't have couples, that would tell us that the applicant optimal and the program optimal were really close to each other in the sense that very few people got different matchings. It doesn't quite tell us that now because we don't have that lattice structure. Okay? But it makes it look like the set of stable matchings is going to be pretty small. Now, remember there's a theorem when there's no couples that says the set of people who are matched is the same at every stable matching. Well, here we have 5 years of data of around 20,000 people a year, so it's about 100,000 people. And you can see the theorem is false, but it's not very false. One new person is unmatched when we switch from program proposing to applicant proposing in 1987, and one new person is matched in 1996. So it's not systematic. It's not that one gets more jobs than the other, and it's not very big. It's 2 in 100,000 people. So this is pretty spooky, right? We know the theorem isn't true, but it looks like it's almost true. And we don't know what's going on. Now, one of the things that we have to worry about is whether these are the true preferences or not. Right? Because we could be, one possibility that you have to at least entertain is that these are highly equilibrated preferences and people have truncated and that's why the core is small. So we have to think about truncation. And we think about truncation in a couple of complicated ways because truncation works really well in the deferred acceptance algorithm because your preference list lower than where you get matched doesn't affect the algorithm at all. So I know that if you truncated just below where you got matched, it wouldn't change anything in a simple matching problem. So when we talk about truncation in simple matching problems, we mean making your list shorter than where you got matched. That's where it might have some effect. But here we don't know that because here it's a multi-pass algorithm. It doesn't just go through once. Remember, it goes through, it produces a matching, and then it goes back and tries to resolve all the blocking pairs. So there's some chance that truncations won't do what we want them to do. So we started with an experiment where we said, supposing we truncate everyone at the match, how much are the preferences below where they're matched influencing the outcome? And it turns out hardly at all. Not at all in 93, for 2 out of 20,000 applicants in 94, for 2 in 95, right? So it looks like truncations are doing what we think they should be doing. Similarly here are the other years, none, 3, and none. This is truncating at the match point. That is, we're letting everyone go to where they got a job, but we're erasing their preferences below their job. Okay, so now we can start to see whether this is manipulable. Okay, that still doesn't get to the question of whether it's true preferences or not. And one way to see if it's manipulable is you say, let's truncate people's preferences just before the job they got. That is, if you get your 7th choice job, let's see what happens if you had listed just your first 6 preferences. And we're trying to do this in an efficient way. This is before big data and very fast computers. And we say, let's truncate everyone's preferences. Then thousands of people will do better. But of course, most of those people are doing better not because they truncated their own preferences, but because everyone else truncated their preferences. There's less competition. So now we go back and we say, let's restore everyone's preferences to where they were, except for these guys who did better. Let's just truncate their preferences. And now only 2,000 people do better, right? 2,000 of them were doing better because of these truncations. And we keep doing that till we get down to the small group of people who could profit one way or the other. Okay, we're down to the same kind of numbers. So it looks like these preferences are not very manipulable when we're truncating applicants' preferences. And we do some other experiments of that sort with, the answer telling us that it looks a whole lot, but not completely, like the theory should tell us, right? If there were no couples, then some applicants could do better in the program proposing algorithm by truncating their preferences, and it's a small number here, and there wouldn't be anyone who could do better here. But instead, we see small numbers in both places and some positive numbers here. Yeah. We left the preferences, we truncated the job you got. So if you got your 7th choice, we try, what I'm calling a truncation here is your first 6 jobs.
Right, so if I got my first choice, presumably you leave me in the algorithm just as the first choice.
If you got your 3rd choice,
First,
then we leave you as your first choice, right?
So that must mean there's not that many conflicts between first. So if you and I have the same first choice, but there's only one slot, then one of us is going to unmatched. So that means that there must not be that many.
So no, absolutely. So many people, right. So 17,000 people truncate, 4,000 do better. The rest do worse. Absolutely. Truncating is a very dangerous thing to do. Absolutely. We're just looking to see who could profitably truncate on their own. Right. We can also play with programs, rank order lists. Let me not do that now. So here we are, and we have some striking computational results that we don't understand yet. It looks like the set of stable matchings is really small. We don't have any theory in 1995 to tell us why that should be true. And what we're worried is that it's not true, but here we are doing what would get us in a simple problem the firm and applicant proposing algorithm, but maybe it's just, maybe it's the tail of an elephant and the rest of the elephant has escaped our observation and he's off somewhere else and is a big elephant and not a little elephant. We're just looking at the tip of his tail. So we're worried. And the question is, how can we address that worry? And we thought of 2 ways to do it. One is to look at matches. It turns out there are a lot of medical markets. There are fellowship markets, markets for more advanced people. We said, let's look at some that exist that don't have any of these complications, that don't have any couples. And another is we're going to do some theoretical computation. So it turns out thoracic surgery, there's a profession that's sort of dying. They're being replaced by interventional cardiologists who put little things into your blood vessels. But thoracic surgery was something that didn't have any couples because it had very, very few women. Thoracic surgeons do heroic kind of surgery. They open you up and look at your heart and hold it in their hand. They didn't have couples. And nevertheless, and they're also a much smaller market. They're 200 and 2 orders of magnitude different, around 200 instead of 20,000. Turns out 200 is big enough, but they have no couples and they have none of the other special features. So these guys fit exactly the theory you learned this morning. So when I run the program proposing version, I will get the program optimal stable match. When I run the applicant proposing version of the deferred acceptance algorithm, I'll get the applicant optimal stable match. That will be the full diameter of the set of stable matches. Anyone who gets a different match everyone who could get a different match at some stable matching will get a different match at these two stable matchings. So the theory tells us perfectly what's going on in this market. And the answers are, in 1991, it didn't make a difference to anyone. In 1992, it made a difference to 2 applicants. In 93 to 2. In 94 and 96, not to any. So the core is small in this market as well. Okay? Now, there's still the question to worry about is maybe it's highly equilibrated. Maybe everyone's truncated their preferences perfectly, and that's why the core is small. So we want to do some theoretical computation. Let's just look at, let's make up some data. We'll generate random preferences. We'll let the market grow large, and we'll see how the core looks. And we'll know the true preferences, quote, the true preferences, because we're generating them. So we're going to be looking at a market with known true preferences and just seeing what the theory doesn't yet tell us. So let's look at a simple marriage model with n workers and n firms, and let's look at uncorrelated preferences. That will let the set of stable matchings be large, right? If one side, for instance, has highly correlated preferences, say everyone agrees on who the best people are on the other side, then the core will consist of a unique point. So uncorrelated preferences let the core be large, yeah.
What is the metric of preference correlation?
These are going to be uniformly generated.
For a given market, how would you say?
That's a good question because, as I'll show you in a minute, we don't see. So some kind of measure, if you had complete preferences, would be something like what's the probability. How predictive is it if I like firm 1 better than firm 2? How predictive is it that you like firm 1 better than firm 2? That test in data is complicated by the fact that we may not apply to many of the same firms. But that sounds like a good name for such a thing to me, but I don't know the answer. Okay, and what I'm going to look at is the number of workers matched differently at the firm optimal and the worker optimal outcome. So this is a simple theoretical model. It's completely in my control. You learned the theory of it this morning. You know just how the theory works. I'm going to generate preferences. I'm going to say how many workers get different matchings. And we just saw in the data, very few workers get different matchings. So what happens if we let n, the number of men and the number of women, grow? Well, it turns out the number of people who get different matchings is almost everyone, right? You generate preferences. You know, the men have preference over the women have preference over the men. They're uncorrelated. What that means is more and more people in their optimal matching get their first choice. But my first choice and your first choice might not be each other. So almost everyone gets a different match at the man optimal and the woman optimal stable match. So we looked at that and we said, no wonder no one's studied, these markets as they get large. That, there's no surprising result here. That's what you'd expect. There's a reason we didn't have a lot of theory about this. And then we said, but that's not what we're seeing. As the market gets large in this little computational experiment, all the men have preference over all the women. All the workers have preferences over all the jobs. All the jobs have preference over all the workers. We say, but that's not what's going on here. You can think of the market growing, and there are more and more jobs you could think of, but there aren't more and more days between November and February when you could go on an interview, right? So as the market grows, some things don't grow. And one of the things we observe in the data is very few people apply to 20 jobs. And by and large, if you don't interview at a job, you won't put it on your rank order list. So very few rank order lists have more than 20 people on them. So we said, let's do the same exercise, but let's put a limit on how long your rank order list can be. So now we're going to generate uncorrelated preferences by saying the workers have uncorrelated preferences and the firms have random preferences over those who apply to them. And we say, pick a K, pick your number, how many places you can apply to, and hold it constant as the number of firms gets large, or the number of jobs get large. And now you say, look at that. Supposing you can only apply to 15 places and the number of firms get large. How big is the core? How many people have different matchings at the core? You get up to 1,000 firms now and it's hardly anyone. So we said there's a reason for the core to be small, for the set of stable matchings to be small. It's that the market somehow gets unlinked from itself by the fact that you can't, when there are thousands of jobs, you can't interview for them all. So your preference lists are short. Now, Itai Ashlagi is going to tell us about yet another reason why the set of stable matchings can be small. But here's one of them, and you look at these and you say, look at that. These are true preferences, right? These preferences we know. So while I can't tell you that the market hasn't perfectly equilibrated as if it were a game of complete information, it's actually very hard to truncate properly because only about 1 in 1,000 people can do better, because everyone else, unless you're one of these people who's getting 2 different matches, you can't manipulate whichever side of the market you're on. Okay, so that means in a large market, it's almost a dominant strategy to state your true preferences, whichever way the deferred acceptance algorithm is organized. Now, we knew that in '95, computationally. It didn't get proved until some computer scientists proved a simple version in 2005 that says when you have short preference lists, the set of stable matchings will get small. And Fuhiro Kojima and Parag Pathak in 2009 extended the argument to many to one to a more germane model. And there the story is the incentives are not as closely related to the size of the set of stable matching, but they show that as the market gets large, it becomes hard to manipulate whichever side you're on. And think about what manipulation means. Manipulation means you get proposals, and you're going to reject not the one you like less, but the one you like more, in the hope of starting a rejection chain that will eventually cause someone to apply to you who you like better. Okay, that's how manipulation works in the deferred acceptance algorithm. So what this says, it says as the market gets large and the lists are short, the chance that one of those rejection chains will come back to you gets small. Okay, so there's still a mostly open empirical puzzle about why we don't run into very many markets where you can't find a stable matching, even though there are couples. And so there's been some recent work on that, but when I say it's still mostly open, I'm going to quickly tell you about some theorems that are not very satisfactory. So once again, I'm going to show you some notation, but I'm doing it not so you should absorb it now, but so you should understand the kind of models that we're working with. Okay, so first some stylized facts. The applicants who participate as couples are a pretty small fraction, and the length of rank order lists is pretty short. Those are going to be the elements of the model. And what I'd like is a theorem that says something like the probability that there won't be a stable matching gets small as the market gets large. So to get a theorem about probabilities of matchings, I have to think about random matching markets. So the approaches I'm going to tell you about, there's a recent paper from the QJE where I'm a co-author with Fuhiro and Parag, and there's a better paper that Itai Ashlagi will a forthcoming paper by all Israelis, as it happens, Itai will tell you a little bit about it. But let me tell you a little about our paper and why Itai's paper is better and what the open kinds of problems are. So to get theorems about probabilities, I'm going to need random markets. So a random market is going to be a market with random preferences. And I'm going to index these markets by their size, by how many jobs there are. And I'm going to have to make some, I'm going to let couples, there are going to be couples in this market. The couples are going to have essentially random preferences. But unconstrained. I'm not making assumptions about how couples form their preferences, what they say to each other when they talk. And I'm going to let the markets grow large by letting the number of students and jobs grow large. And we've already seen that not every large market will have the properties we want. If the rank order list can grow large at the same rate as the size of the market, then the core will be large even without couples. And there'll be all sorts of things going on. So I'm going to have a maximum length of rank order lists. Now in the actual paper, it turns out the rank order list can grow with the market. It just can't grow linearly. It can't grow as fast as the market. So eventually, you can only rank a small fraction of the jobs as the market gets large. And here's a weakness in our paper. We're going to have the number of couples grow, where's A? Couples grow, I need the number A somewhere because couples are growing less than root A, but A is going to be, here we go, A is less than half. They're growing less than square root. So that's too slow. That means in the limit, the fraction of couples is 0. Okay? if the fraction of couples was 0, I wouldn't be up here telling you about couples. So in the finite markets we look at, we have positive fraction of couples. Now, Itai and his colleagues relax that to be nonlinear, that A should just be less than 1. But what we don't yet know is what can you say about when the couples grow proportionally to the size of the market. But what you can say here, well, let me not tell you how we do it. I'm running out of time. But what you can say, and incidentally, our limit theorems are really limit theorems. We're not looking for speed of convergence. So that's another way in which these results could be improved. We're looking at markets that are so big that couples rarely bump into each other. But why is it true that we can say when the market grows large, the probability that there exists a stable matching converges to 1 as the number of hospitals approaches infinity? The key element of the proof is that when the market is large but the rank order lists are short, then when you finally find a stable matching, there are going to be some firms that are unmatched, even when there are many more applicants than there are firms. Okay? So the nature of short preference lists means there's going to be some coordination failure. There's going to be some firms that only interview people who they don't get. There are going to be some people who only go on interviews that don't yield them jobs. Okay? And what that means is if a couple initiates a rejection chain, it's unlikely going to come back. It's not likely going to come back and form a cycle with the same hospitals. It's more likely going to end in one of these vacant jobs, right? A rejection chain that has someone propose to a job that's vacant stops. So the formal statement is there's a constant beta. Think of beta as being like 1 over 1,000, a fraction of the jobs, such that in a submarket, even without couples, there'll be beta times n hospitals that have at least 1 vacant position. So even when there are lots more students than hospitals, as the market grows large, the number of hospitals that don't get a match will grow linearly. It may be a tiny number, but it'll grow linearly. And that's what means that rejection chains mostly end with a vacancy rather than coming back to you to either cause problems for couples or to allow you to manipulate. So let me see if I can show you. Oh, here's a list from Elliott's website well, some of it's from Elliott's website of many of the matches that use the Roth Parenson algorithm, the algorithm I've been describing to you. And many of these have couples. So when I say that these are annual markets and it's very rare that you can't find a match that's stable with respect to couples. It's a trade secret of Elliott's just when this happens. So that means there's always going to be a scramble, right? This theorem I've sketched for you says you do your matching with or without couples. There are going to be some hospitals with desirable jobs, right? Because remember, there are 23,000 jobs in the U.S. and there are 30,000 applicants. So all American jobs are desirable if you're sitting in the right kind of medical school overseas. There are going to be places with desirable jobs that are not filled. So there's going to have to be a scramble. There's going to have to be a way of filling those jobs afterward. So here's a recent graph of unfilled positions and unmatched applicants. There are a lot more applicants than there are jobs in the United States, mostly from overseas. The American doctors all get matched, basically. But there's plenty of unmatched applicants, but at the same time, there's 1,000 unmatched positions. So you have to do something after the market. There's a market design problem that you have to deal with here. And this is one where they didn't ask our advice. It turns out the NRMP has had a change in administration. They no longer are as open to advice as they used to be. But they thought of their own plan. So what they used to do was just have what they called a scramble, which was a telephone market. And when you looked at the jobs that they could keep track of, that market worked very quickly by exploding offers, and most of the jobs that were filled were filled very quickly. Incidentally, let me tell you something just about the human features of this market. Years ago, so many medical schools have sort of a party on the day the match is announced. So it's match day, the match is announced, and you see pictures in the New York Times of people jumping up and down and hugging each other. And many years ago, they used to also tell you on that day if you weren't matched. So your buddies are jumping up and down and hugging each other, and you're sort of crying into your envelope because you didn't get a match. So now they let you know. They typically match days a Tuesday, I guess, and they let you know on the Friday before, I think. And they say you weren't matched, and here's a list of the positions that weren't matched. You better get on the phone and get yourself a job. And that way, on match day, when your buddies are all jumping up and down and saying, I'm going to Boston, where are you going? You can jump up and down and saying, I'm going to Mississippi. And, but at least, you've got a job. Now, this is a stressful and disorganized part of the match, so they decided to organize it. But so they had a scramble work group, and Elliot and I weren't invited. And what they proposed was a series of exploding offers. So not a deferred acceptance algorithm, but rather there'll be a couple of set time periods where they'll make an exploding offer. You'll have to say yes or no without knowing what's coming. If you get an offer, you can only get another offer if you say no to the first one. Remember, you already haven't gotten an offer. So we argued that this wouldn't work well. And they've only published this graph for the first year. There's been a second year now that we haven't seen. But what you see is in the first day, almost all the jobs are taken. And after that, so a lot's going on in the first day. Partly what that means is a lot's going on before the first day, right? If you know that it's an exploding offer market, it's really important to make your offers to people who'll take them, because if you're a firm with an unfilled position and you don't fill your position in the first day, it's going to be very hard to fill it after that with people who you want. There's plenty of applicants, but maybe not the ones you want. So Scott and me and other people wrote a paper about this saying we didn't think it was a well-designed match. Remains to be seen how that plays out. In the United States, we're increasing the number of residencies, but we're increasing the number of medical students, medical graduates of American medical schools, but we're not increasing the number of residencies yet. So, Congress in its wisdom wants to reduce the shortage of American doctors. So we're going to graduate more doctors, but we're not going to have any more residents. So what it means is there'll be more American doctors, more doctors trained in the United States. And we'll see how that plays out on things like this. But at the moment, they have sort of a not well-designed scramble. But a scramble is always going to be an important part of the market. That's what the lesson of these big markets was.
Why don't they apply the same mechanism for the scramble?
Good idea. Yeah, as it happens, we think that would be a good idea. You tell me. So one of the things about market design is we don't always get asked for our advice. Our advice doesn't always get taken.
Some markets do have a second match.
Yeah. Incidentally, there are concerns about a second match, which is that if you make the scramble less unpleasant, there'll be more people in it. Okay, and the kind of concerns that they have are there are some medical professions that are very desirable. Dermatology is one. Dermatology is what's called a lifestyle specialty. Your patients don't die. They don't call you in the middle of the night. It's a nice job. So a lot of people would like to be dermatologists. They don't get many interviews because dermatology gets a lot of applications. So a natural thing to do is if you get 6 dermatology interviews, you should then also go on 6 internal medicine interviews and get a job. Now, every year there are a couple of dermatology positions in the scramble. So if the scramble were working really well, you might think to yourself, I'll truncate my list at dermatology because I'd really, really like to be a dermatologist, and I'll go for it in the scramble. And so one thought is that there's a benefit to having the scramble be really awful. It doesn't tempt people to manipulate by waiting for the scramble. But nevertheless, we agree with you that it would be good to have a second match. Okay, so there are unresolved design issues here as well. Yes?
One question you always had now that you somehow have to solve the problems in the post market. So couldn't you always look at market control preferences revealed? So for example, that hospitals do more interviews, or that you have a kind of market for the interviews, so that the answer can.
Well, a lot of firms have done plenty of interviews. It's just they've interviewed people they're not going to be able to hire.
Yeah, that's the point. So somehow you have some strategic decisions they have to do before they
Yeah.
actually make their.
No, that's true. So sometimes when you design school choice mechanisms, and we'll talk about that a bit as well, that's one of the things that comes up, that you could look at students' applications and say to them, you haven't applied to enough places. A guy with your grades has to apply to more schools than you've applied to. And we've proposed some decision aids of that sort, but not in this market. Okay? Questions? Yeah? Ori?
I have an empirical question. Maybe the answer is I don't know. We don't have any evidence. But least anecdotally, how many of the students actually understand that they can beat the system?
Good question. Good. Excellent question. Excellent question. So it's more or less a dominant strategy. How many understand that? You know, at the time we did this, we published papers. They refer to those papers in their documents. You have to be sure that most people never think about looking at those papers. What we hope, and there's some evidence from school choice, is that over time you understand that if the claims in the papers were false, someone would have read them and you would hear about it. So in school districts where the school choice mechanism does not make it a dominant strategy to state your preferences, the newspaper columnists around school choice time are full of advice on how you should play the system. And so what we hope in school choice and in this is we announce that it's a dominant strategy, or in this case that only 1 in 1,000 can manipulate, and that we strongly advise you to state your true preferences. You cannot benefit yourself otherwise. And here are the references. So how much of an effect that has? Are there people who think they can manipulate? Absolutely. Are there folk tales around? Certainly. But in the markets I've looked at where you can manipulate, there are a lot more of those tales and they're better informed.
Are there now consultants who help applicants how to construct their applications based, in fact, on the existing theories and data?
Well, the existing theories say that the consultants cannot help you with your preference list, right? So I don't think there are consultants for that. There certainly are consultants in the United States on applying for colleges, things like that. But here, mostly not. Let me just tell a story out of sequence about Boston school choice. I'm a little over time. Let me tell one more story and stop. In Boston, we introduced something like this that makes it a dominant strategy for families to tell their true preferences. And we published little brochures that would go home with children